Thank you again for joining. Let me introduce the topic and then the guest of honor. So, when I came back from the US, believe it or not, I was leaving New York on March 12th or 13th, which was the date kind of took off. I came back and was speaking to Bhavish. And the first time I heard the word opportunity was when I was speaking to Bhavish in the middle of this crisis. And I want everybody to kind of keep in perspective. We all know travel sector is hurt, cabs are not running. It's very easy to potentially think that, Ola as a large company has raised a lot of money. So, their problems are different and not as relevant for us. I don't think so. I think the problems at scale are actually worse. Uh, and it's much harder to handle because you've built a certain cost structure, you've built a certain brand. So I'm hoping that the discussion here is going to be relevant for everybody, whether you have 5 people or you have 50,000. Um, so first time I heard was from Bhavish, but with that, Bhavish, let's get started. I have to introduce the topic by asking you about your haircut first. Say, you are not a guy who's balding. If you were balding, I would have said, this is the opportunity in the threat of balding and you shaved it off. What happened?
No, it's a time for change, Avi, and this is the time to look forward to different things. And I'm just kidding. Yeah, my hair had grown long. My wife was trying to cut them. Didn't end up with a good experiment, so we decided to just remove the whole thing. And it's actually much easier. Life is much more convenient.
Best things to do. Everybody is looking at haircuts in various ways. You went for it literally.
There are things you should not try at home in a lockdown. One of them is a haircut.
Yes. For the benefit of everybody here, I had my son do it, and we clearly miscommunicated on which number to use on the machine, and I had to do some damage control. So let's start. I'll give my own thoughts on this, but Bhavish, I want to start with you. We all heard about coronavirus probably December, Jan. When did it actually hit you? If you go back in time, and it almost feels like an eternity to all.
Yeah.
When did it hit you that this was going to be serious and would have serious business implications? And then if you had to summarize the top 3 steps you took, would be great. A framework I have used is effect on people, effect on cash, effect on other stakeholders, but whatever framework you have, would be great to hear kind of how that's.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way to start off, Avi. I think for every business owner, every entrepreneur, or every person, this whole situation, since it evolved so fast, everybody had a different way of coming to the same point where we are today because it just grew so fast. For us, we were in a context where we were focusing a lot on our international business, and I personally was spending a lot of time in London because we had just launched London, begun our business there, invested a significant amount, and business has been doing well there, and we were on a very steep upward trajectory. So the January, February, March period was when I was doing a lot of trips to the UK and back. And in January, we saw China went through, mid-January, they shut it down, or 20th, around that time, they shut it down. In India, we were still feeling that this is not going to come here. Because in general, many of these outbreaks or epidemics that happen don't trace their way to India because we're not that deep into global supply chains. And I think the extent of the pandemic was not clear to anybody, forget us entrepreneurs, but even political players globally or political leaders. So the first, and hence, because I was not even in India, for me, my perspective was actually being driven a lot more by what was happening in the West. And, spending time in the UK, it was towards the later part of February and towards early part of March, it was becoming clear that things are going to get bad. Over there, even though the government there did not immediately clamp down or do a lockdown, the word on the streets was getting a little concerning. And being in the ride-sharing business, you get to hear this firsthand from the drivers and everybody because they're like the information glue for many street-level information. So, so I remember I was also in the UK. I had made a trip towards the second week of March to go there for a few days. I was there till the 10th. I was planning to extend my trip, but I decided not to, not because of COVID, but because I had some work back in India. And I flew back, and as soon as I flew back, it was clear that the shit is going to hit the fan. Right. So that's how my own perspective evolved in this. So to some extent, I would say we had a bit of a leading entry into this in terms of our own perception. And we ended up doing a few things to quickly react to this pandemic. Firstly, we had a lot of our Indian employees spread across our international operations. And we're a company which tries and ensures we're on the place of action, not just managing it remotely. That's one thing which we might discuss on how that's changing. But so a big decision for us was, should we call our people back or should we let them be in those markets? So we decided to call our people back, I think on the 16th or the 17th. The Indian people, the local teams are still there and they're protected there. So the first focus was, how can we ensure employee safety in India and in our international market? So we called our people back. We set up work from home, which I think every company did in India, where people were given optional work from home based on their own concerns. So we set that up, and we made sure even our our employees in other countries are as safe as we can enable them to be. Then secondly, we very quickly, and again, as the situation was evolving fast through the middle of March, before the Indian lockdown, we, as a leadership team, we spent enough time physically together to really build scenarios on how we think this is going to evolve. And it was quite clear that it's not going to be a short-term lockdown. So we actually built a scenario where there will be a 3-month lockdown, 6-month lockdown, 1 year to normal, 2 years to normal. And those week or 10 days of the leadership team, the top 8-10 people huddling together in person before the lockdown really helped us set the tone for post-lockdown scenario. And we had a clear plan on how are we going to manage our costs across fixed costs, direct costs, everything. What are we projecting in terms of revenues? And also, once we had the clear perspective on how to manage costs, we started to also think of where is the silver lining in this situation. So these are the ways we started to deal with the evolving situation. And I think it's even today it's still evolving. It's not every week brings a new context.
Yeah. No, so sharing I remember I was in the US where we were reading about how the infection was tracking in Italy, and by that time, I remember before, I don't know if Manish of MSwipe is here, but before leaving, around 3rd or 4th, I was leaving, and we had an email exchange, and he said, do your companies have a BCP? And I actually Googled BCP because I hadn't thought of it, and then realized that we had not guided our companies towards that at all. I think it became obvious that this was going to get worse around the time that things were going crazy in Italy. I would say that it's clear the framework that's worked well for our companies. And again, guys, just redirecting you to the resources section. I think there are some beautiful articles there. Nobody has the answers, but there's some beautiful articles there of different stages of managing this. I think the thought of what you said, Bhavish, costs, 3 resources to manage, right? People, cash more than anything else in the financials, and stakeholders. And I know you've done a lot of work with the stakeholders also, so we'll come to it. So I think that's been the framework we have used as a VC. I'm not going to sit here and say that we had to do so many different things. We are privileged and we are lucky that it's much easier for us to work from home, and it's small firm. So I'm not even going to. I know it's much harder for everybody else on this call. So one piece that obviously comes up a lot, Bhavish, and it's a general question, and I'm combining 2 most up-quoted questions here from Shobit and Aditya. You said very quickly you started looking for the silver lining. I think there is the overall view, which is the defense, which is how do you survive? And everybody first was in that. All of us were in that. And then there is the offense, which is how can you thrive? Is there a question? But I think there's a deeper question also in that, right? Which is your current PMF and your value prop to your current customer set, is it under threat in the post-COVID world, A, and B, is there a better PMF for you in the post-COVID world? So macro question for you, and then specific to Ola, how are you thinking about it?
So before I answer the specific PMF questions, or even at a macro level PMF question, let me just answer how I believe we should see this crisis, right? And I actually feel the Prime Minister set the tone very well in a LinkedIn post lately, earlier this week, where he said every crisis comes with its own opportunities, and I also believe there are opportunities that are going to exist. There will be opportunities that come in the external world also, and there will be opportunities as we look within our organizations also to really change many things. Because such kind of a disruption never happens, and if it has happened, there are things which will not remain the same again. And if we can understand those themes and understand those strategic vectors, we can actually change our business models, change our ways of working, operating models to that. Right. So, and I think all of us as entrepreneurs have every entrepreneur has a very instinctive feel for what I'm saying. It's not something new that I'm saying. We just have to discover what our organization and our particular business context means to this overall global context change. For example, I was reading the other day that all IT companies are actually realizing work from home is not that bad. It's not that bad for productivity of a certain type of work. And maybe going forward, many IT companies, including the large ones like all the large Indian IT companies, might have a large portion of their people working from home. That's an example of figuring out opportunity in this time of crisis. Otherwise, in the normal course of business, nobody would have imagined, let's try and experiment with work from home en masse. Right? For me personally, work from home is not the most productive. That's my personal style. But as an organization, there are parts of our organization which might be able to do that better. For example, in our own, as Avnish was speaking about the business continuity plans, we also have a fairly large call center and a fairly large customer support center. We run a global customer support center out of India, and a few thousands of people supporting both drivers and customers. And the biggest concern for me as the shutdown was happening in India was, how will we, because our global businesses are still operating at lower levels, but they're not fully stopped. So concern was, how will we manage all of this customer support? But we were also able to put in a system and a protocol where our people are working from home and are able to manage it. So those are examples of how within our organizations, our ways of work can evolve to the future, right? When we look outside, at a macro level, I believe some of the big structural changes that were anyways happening in economy, in consumption, or in technology are only going to get accelerated with this. For example, digitization, automation will only get accelerated. Things like clean energy, etc., will only get accelerated. There might be some speed bumps in different businesses, etc., basis the fact that there's a shutdown, so the entire mobility industry is shut down right now. All those are very temporary blips. But the big structural changes will be that the acceleration, the big technological changes will only get accelerated. Consumers, I believe there was a movement away from owning products to servicification of various products that also will only get accelerated. But unless companies evolve their business models, evolve their propositions, consumers would reject them if the same old stuff is being sold to them in the future. So that's one big theme that I personally believe in, that the acceleration of technology will only increase. Now we have to see in our own businesses what that means, right? Like, for example, in Ola, what that means is, if I look at just the ride-sharing business, right? The ride-sharing business serves customers who don't have their own vehicles, or who might have one vehicle in a family, etc. Now, I believe, and again, this is not something very non-obvious that I'm saying, there will be a lot of people who would rather use a ride-sharing vehicle because it gives you that personalized space versus use a public transport vehicle. There might be many people who might say, oh, I don't want to use ride-share at all, I want to use my own car. But they might not be willing to pay up for a car. So there might be solutions possible around subscriptions. And then many startups, I'm sure some of them are also on the call, have been thinking about ideas like these. So that the opportunities are there for us to see. Consumer sentiment will go through a bit of a dip in the short to midterm, but long term, we're all a very social animal, right? So we will still need to do all the things we were doing. The big changes afoot will only get accelerated. So that's the big message and the big theme that I believe.
Yeah. No, and I would say, just like you just said, right? I think I remember I was chatting with Bhavish, and I can't remember what the context was, and he said, people and goods will still need to move. And I think for people who are thinking about this question, as I think about this question of PMF, I think the question to ask yourself is some industry going to be fundamentally changing or getting hurt where digitization can't actually help that industry, right? So the reality is forms of mobility, if you look at mobility, forms of mobility may change. But fundamentally, mobility is going to be there for some period of time, maybe reduced, but net it will be there in different forms. Um, I believe that people on this call should be thinking about at least some of our discussions have been interesting with founders on this concept of is your core PMF enhanced in the near term or is hurt in the near term. And I would say apart from the lockdown related issues for companies that have involved in delivery of goods and stuff or labor or whatever, net like Bhavish said, digitization, you should be in the right place. How you think about that thin edge of the wedge in the PMF might require more thinking for people as they're thinking about coming out of COVID and how do you make the best of the opportunity. Bhavish, there's a question. I'll throw it to you rather than me, and I'll have to think about it. If you had to start a new business right now, top down, again going to the opportunity, which sector? Presumably, there would be other sectors that would be looking more exciting.
You know, Ola is in the mobility industry. Right? That's our predominant core focus. 99% of our focus is in the mobility industry. And in the mobility industry, we are brought into many different parts of the value chain. And the mobility industry is one of the most worst hit with this lockdown. Maybe the only sector which I would believe is worst hit is travel and hospitality. But after that, it's the mobility sector. But I actually believe this is the best time for a disruptive thinking in the mobility industry. The incumbents, which are saddled with old business models, were anyway slowly facing the disruption that companies like us bring. But this is the time to actually double down and build for the future. And I don't. There are many sectors which are interesting and exciting. Many of them have faced a very positive bump with this crisis. But if you take the long-term view, all of these industries will be back to their pre-COVID levels. But the key question is, what change have you as an organization or as an entrepreneurial company made into that industry? What's your delta? And one point on that I would like to also share is, again, my philosophy. I see a lot of entrepreneurs sometimes because there's a crisis, we end up rushing to launch things in this crisis which we believe are the need of the hour right now, without thinking through deeply about what is the long-term structural change, is this building the long-term structural change. Now, my view is these short-term things wouldn't create a good long-term benefit for the companies. I'm not saying do things slowly, we have to do things very fast, but we have to think through them deeply. Many times we will end up just reacting or shooting from the hip in this crisis situation and waste our resources, which is people, energy, and even money, and launch some superficial things which might not be relevant in the post-COVID world.
So pushing that train of thought, I want to come back and I'll give more answers from my perspective on this. But Bhavish, you are the only company that's not doing grocery deliveries. It seems to me, or not to me, but to the world, that no-brainer thing to do, take advantage of the situation. How does that go in with your thought here of saying don't rush into things? What is the strategic rationale?
Yeah, see, I believe there are many better placed companies to do grocery delivery than us. The traditional players, all the traditional retailers in India, the large Indian groups, the new age players, Grofers, Big Basket, even the food delivery guys have been doing grocery delivery. Now, my view is we don't have any strength in the supply chain in that business. We don't have any specific domain expertise in the logistics of that business, which is different from let's say, our cars running around with groceries in the trunk, right? So it doesn't make sense from a long-term perspective for us to do that. There are companies which can do it much better than us, right? And even from a short-term perspective, we've been exploring whether we can really help out our driver partners by giving them access to grocery delivery, and we've done a little bit of things with a few partners, but none of those are scaled-up solutions yet. Right, so it's not like we can enable 10,000 driver partners to do grocery delivery. The thing we are focused on is actually leveraging some of our technology stack and leveraging our core ride-sharing transportation expertise in helping wherever we can in states and communities. For example, we've worked with various state governments to enable emergency transport services, which was not there when the shutdown happened, right? And we actually had to work with every state, and states have been very receptive and very partnership oriented when it comes to these things. So we are now today live in about almost 20 cities with our emergency services, which is transport where you can only go to a hospital or a clinic, and we also ensure that the driver is healthy, and we also ensure the customer and driver don't infect each other. We have like screens in the cars, etc. So we have improved the or made sure the vehicle ride is healthy and sanitized for both parties. That's one example of what we did. Another example of what we did again, by the way, both these examples I'm sharing are not for profit. We are not making money in this. The emergency stuff also we've offered at a cost basis. The drivers make income, we don't make any income. The other thing we also thought was, can we work with the different, because this is the harvest season. This is when many parts of our country, the crop gets harvested. So as we were talking to states, what was clear was the food supply chain in these states needs a little bit of help through technology. And we felt that our technology stack can actually be leveraged to do tracking, flow control, authentication of the entire supply chains of many parts of the food supply chain in states, etc. So we actually very, very quickly, our engineering team within a few days built that solution, and we took it to states. Again, it's offered free of cost, where we can help out different states. In some cases, our drivers also get deployed in these, so they get an income opportunity. So we're doing things like those, which might not seem like the obvious thing to do, but it helps out wherever it can in communities and societies, and it also enables our drivers to be deployed at a slightly larger scale.
Yeah. So I think the lesson I would draw out here for everybody on this call is that the obvious thing to do may not be the best thing to do. And I think the ability to say that this is not strategically in line with the long-term shift is probably as important. We all know saying what not to do is more potentially important than what to do. I will go back to the question and add my perspective on post PMF and structural changes and what we think. So I think again, drawing out from what Bhavish said, is the change in the industry temporal or structural? And I would argue things like grocery, I am ordering groceries from my neighborhood Kirana guy. He's doing a fantastic job, and it's on WhatsApp, and there's no structural change that I don't need any of the online guys for the delivery. However, if you look at telemedicine, and again, some of these are well-known examples, but sharing for the group, I think there's a structural change. The structural change is that it is highly dependent on supply of doctors. And the concept has been around for probably a decade, but the doctors were not ready. They were not ready to do this online. And the products also not fully there, by the way. If you ask the doctors, they will still say that the products are about average. So they need things like waiting rooms. They want a full replication of that experience. Does anybody provide it? Not yet. Obviously, EdTech has been talked about a lot. I think live commerce could pick up. I think the video piece of it is a structural shift. But I think very importantly in trying to figure some of this out, I would encourage people to think about what is a structural shift versus a temporal shift. And the temporal shift will go away. I want to remind people to please upvote the questions that are there. I see a bunch of questions coming in and we want to address as many, but please upvote as many as you can so we address it. So one question has been addressed to me as a VC. So Bhavish, let me just take a minute to answer that. And the question is, how are we thinking about deploying for the next few months and valuation adjustment? So look, I'll tell you, first of all, I don't know, I haven't lived through this kind of a crisis in my life either, but I've lived through a few, including dot-com bubble and 2008-9. Here's what we are hearing. What we have heard from investors is typically, if you look at the 2008-9 crisis, people are better off in this crisis than they were in that crisis. And it's interesting for what reasons. Today, the largest companies in the world are tech companies, and they are $1 trillion plus market caps. And so the public market, the NASDAQ, by the way, is supposedly, I haven't checked recently, but at the same level as it was 6 months ago, even though the S&P and some of these other indices may be down. So a bunch of the global investors have very large exposure to these so-called FANGs stocks: Facebook, Apple, Amazon, Netflix, Google, Zoom now. And they have, these stocks are at, some of them are at all-time highs. So they have more liquidity in the short term. And ultimate source of capital affects how this source of capital behaves, right? However, that's the good news. The bad news is some of the bad news is not fully priced in. So you saw what has happened to oil. They have a large commodities portfolio that's probably getting trashed, and that's illiquid. People's view is real estate is going to suffer significantly, and a lot of them have a large commercial portfolio. So when you put it all together, there's a saying in investing: you don't catch a falling knife. You wait for it to fall, and then you think about it. Right now, I would say this is not a time where you're going to see VC saying, hey, the markets are correcting, let's jump in all in and all of that. But it's not a time where people are not investing. As far as we are concerned, I would say our pace might be 20-30% than normal for the next 6 months, and then it'll pick up. And the history of crises is typically the first 6 to 12 months is the worst time to invest, because the valuations haven't adjusted, but reality has gone down. You think you're getting a good deal, but it's only going to go worse. Uh, to answer the question on valuations, if you're getting money, take it. We have had signed term sheets which have gotten renegotiated. The global statistic is a third of the deals are not happening, maybe even half now. They're just, people are walking out of the deals. And the others that are happening, I would say 80% are getting what is called retraded. It may seem we are not doing that. We walked into this crisis with a number of signed term sheets. We are going ahead with all of them, but that's not the case globally. And so if you're getting money at new terms, just take it. And it may not sound nice right now, but 6 to 12 months out, it may be a blip. And if you have cut your cost structures enough that you can get through that phase, um, even then raise some and maybe dilute less, but still raise the money. So I hope this answers the question. Bhavish, you deal with a lot of foreign investors and stuff. Anything to add here on, and any advice as an entrepreneur if you are facing this situation and a term sheet is getting renegotiated? How would you think about it?
I think my thoughts are exactly as yours. This is the time where we should just take whatever money comes. Obviously, if an investor is trying to be too smart, you have to have a perspective on long-term relationship there. Maybe that person is not the right guy. But in general, all good quality investors will try and do a fair deal. Some term sheets might get renegotiated, but it might be for the best long-term interests anyways. So my one line advice would be to take whatever money, if there is money on the table, take it, because we don't know how long this crisis will last.
Yeah. Uh, Topic of the day: Facebook Geo, Flipkart, Walmart. So are the Americans taking over again? What is your thought, and how do you see some of these developments?
See, I'll make a macro comment again. This is my perspective, and not about Facebook Geo, because Facebook Geo is not about those two companies, but about structural disruption, how they're changing the whole business model and value chain of the retail industry or whatever, right? I think our startup industry in general, I'm making a general point, not a specific point, but in general, we have kind of gotten lazy to solve deep business model problems. We've been operating at the superficial layer, trying to subsidize customers or subsidize suppliers, etc. And it's not like only investors are guilty or only entrepreneurs are guilty. Everybody has been part of the same game, right? And this is the time to actually introspect, at a business model level, are we doing the things which are going to create value long term? Pricing is not value, right? Offering things cheap, getting some transactions, VCs getting excited about it and putting money on the table. This is not what builds value in the long term. And what's also, I believe, going to happen is all this game is now over. The more fundamentally strong business models will win in the long term. There might be short-term blips where somebody who can make a few more transactions, gets more funding for that particular round, etc. All those things will always happen. Short-term differences in companies always are there. But in the long term, if you are investing your resources, which is your time and your money, in following a clear strategic path for yourself, then you will end up in a better place in the long term. And this is the time to make that change within your own organizations and looking out into opportunities that lie ahead. Right. So in that sense, if you look at Facebook, I think it's their strategy and their ambitions are clear. So if startups are in that line of business, they might have to introspect and say what more they need to do.
And there was a second part of the question, which is, are startups threatened by this? And let me tell you, sitting here chatting with Bhavish and the Ola example, I think in 2014, 15, maybe first half of 16, every company was going to be a cab operator. I used to probably send Bhavish a message every week saying, so and so is starting up in this. And we are talking about all the large companies, right? So look, I think to his point, you have to create real value. Let's also give credit where it's due, which is Geo has resulted in a big inflection in data. And if frankly, we couldn't be doing this, I'm on the Geo network right now. So the level of, putting the pressure of bringing high quality bandwidth at low prices has helped the country. And Facebook has helped most of our companies advertise, right? So are they becoming too big? And I'm not going to go there. But the point is, these are pipes. Pipes may be getting stronger, but that doesn't mean that the pipes will own all the businesses. And you have multiple examples of people on the call. And that threat in my history, I've never seen it play out. In the dot-com bubble, the telcos were going to be on everything, right? So I do think, like Bhavish is saying, there's continued role for innovation. Startups are just fundamentally more nimble, but historically, one could argue that we have not been as innovation focused and not have been as focused on building real businesses, which frankly I see in the last 2-3 years has changed significantly. And I think if we continue that path, we will be in good shape. Bhavish, there's a question on overall, it is to me also, on the EV space. Isn't this, you should, just to give people perspective, I've been asked why I've not invested in the EV space. We have invested in Ola Electric. It's one of our large investments. So it would be great if you can just talk a little bit about it. And then how do you see that trend in this current scenario?
Yeah, so I think the question is more broadly, what are the trends in the electric mobility space? Oh, sure, okay. So
let me repeat the question. What do you think of the future of EVs for shared mobility? How will the market post-COVID pan out for EVs? And what are the key areas?
Yeah. See, I think if you look at the Indian context of electric mobility, it's still very, very early in its penetration, inception, etc. Right? Four-wheelers electric mobility is very, very small. It's not even a blip on the radar right now in India. Two-wheelers, maybe something, some at the lower end of the market, the cheaper end of the market, there is some penetration. Three-wheelers, again, there's nothing in the auto rickshaw segment, but the e-rickshaws is a particular cohort. At a macro level, I believe this whole clean energy transition will get accelerated with this crisis at a global level, right? Consumers will definitely want, look around us. I think everybody's appreciating the fact that our cities are less polluted, less crowded, less, just there's less haze around, less smoke around. So I think that will be a lingering emotion people will carry on, and companies which can take advantage of that and build their products around that can have a accelerated penetration curve. And electric mobility is like that. Already the ducks were almost in order where the economics for some vehicle segments were starting to work out better for electric. For example, two-wheelers, three-wheelers, even without government subsidies, was starting to work out cheaper than gasoline vehicles. Four-wheelers in India, I think, is still far out. It's a much more complicated space, but two and three-wheelers was already starting to get worked out. And frankly, it's an opportunity for all companies to say there are 20 million two-wheelers sold in India every year. Can this crisis be used to accelerate penetration of electric two-wheelers and get to a majority electric share much faster? And in general, I believe that these disruptions happen faster than anybody thinks. Once the economics are aligned, once the business model is set up properly, and the convergence of technology and business model happens, and whichever company does that best, just rides that S-curve. And I think electric mobility is at the cusp of that S-curve in India. Indian electric mobility will be different from global electric mobility business models. The West is much more four-wheelers, trucks, and SUVs, and cyber trucks, and all those things. India, as we know, is much more the smaller vehicles, lighter vehicles, which actually are much more. The electrification of those vehicle formats is actually a much more faster, better proposition compared to gasoline.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Aniket's question, I think, has been answered, but let me pick it up again because I think Bhavish made a very important point. And the question here is, will people switch to rideshare or to private cars in the post-COVID world? And I think the point to take there for the broader group is that it could be either. You know, there are people who will shift from mass public transportation to rideshare because that's safer, and then there are people who might do the other way. So I think spotting the opportunity and keeping on top of it, like Bhavish had said, is important. This is an interesting question. I'll throw it to you and to then I'll think of answering myself. Nitin asks, is deep discounting your offerings to generate cash flow at this stage the right option? As an entrepreneur, what do you think?
I'm trying to understand the question. Like, I don't believe you can generate cash flow by deep discounting. Because by definition, you will be paying more from what your cost will be higher than your revenue. So I actually believe in general, deep discounting is not a right strategy, and more so in this time when it's about conserving cash. So you might generate some transactions, but actually you might be losing a lot of cash. Sometimes, as entrepreneurs, we don't see the way cash is flowing clearly enough. So deep discounting in general never generates sustainable cash flows.
Yeah, and same, instinctively, exactly same answer. I would say you have to deep discount your cost base, not your revenue base. And if you do this, you could be potentially permanently damaging your business. And I think to Bhavish's point, even first principles may not be able to get there. I'll come back to some of the questions here in this chat. Bhavish, looking at global patterns and China recovery, or anything else you're hearing, any thoughts on recovery trajectory? What are you bracing for or preparing for?
For us, what we are planning for as a base case is 3 to 6 months of intermittent shutdowns, and then 6 to 12 months of recovery after that. And that's specific to the mobility industry also, which is a little harder hit than other industries. Now, what we don't know, and I don't want to be a pundit who knows everything. I don't think anybody knows yet, but what we don't know is the extent of structural economic damage in the world. China might have recovered well in the short term because of local consumption coming up, pent-up consumption happening as soon as the lockdowns opened up. But who knows, that economy is dependent on exports a lot. If the West is going to go down into a massive recession, how does that impact Chinese consumer sentiment? How does that then impact just the revenues of the large companies there, and hence consumption in general? So I think the macro picture is very, very unclear. And if you look at how different economies or different governments have tried to give bailouts or support to industries in their own countries, right? So many European countries have tried to give employment support. So if a company like us or any other company in the UK or even in Australia or Europe, mainland Europe, if any of those companies were thinking of firing people, the government said, okay, please don't fire, we will pay 80% of their salaries. And the reason governments are doing that is because they are trying to ensure, as the economy comes back up post-lockdown, there is enough income in the consumer base to actually consume. Because otherwise, if this goes into a massive consumption shock, then who knows how long it takes to recover. Right. So I don't think anybody yet has a clear picture of what is the lasting impact on the economy. So I think we all should have our base case scenarios, but we should plan for the worst case also, where if there's a significant downward trend of consumption and tough economic status for the next few years.
Yeah, which would be.
I don't hope for that, and I don't expect that either. But who knows?
Yeah. Now, which would be the L-shaped scenario? So, just sharing my perspective, when we started talking about scenarios, we talked about what none of us really expected. U, L. I think what Bhavish is saying is what is my current thesis and a bit of a worry, because it's hard for businesses, which is the W. Much more of a zigzag recovery, and you open up, something flares up. You saw some of this yesterday in Maharashtra, where we opened up, people went a bit crazy and Maharashtra shut down Pune and Mumbai again, even without infections. But 2 weeks from now, we may see a spike of infections because of single day behavior. So W is what I would plan for. Like I said, we have posted on the chat some resources on China recovery. I would say China recovery is going to be potentially the wrong benchmark because they shut down one province uh, and very clearly and came out of it with no infections. I didn't know this number, but Shanghai and Beijing's, and I may be wrong, but directionally right, about maximum infections were 500 cumulative. So we are looking at a very different scenario. So China is probably not the benchmark. Hopefully, US is also not the benchmark because we have had lockdowns early. But I would be prepared for a W scenario so it doesn't hit you, as a negative surprise when coming out of that situation. Um, let's see what else.
One more point I would say is in line with this thinking, and again, something we focused on a lot was to ensure we can do whatever it takes for our driver community. And each business has its own suppliers or vendors or partners, etc. So we set up a fund. I personally donated all my next year's salary to that fund. We also enabled consumers to donate. We did a bit of crowdfunding in that, and that fund is used for now emergency support for drivers, be it because drivers are not people who have a lot of money saved up. So through that fund now we're giving emergency healthcare support for drivers, non-COVID related. COVID we have anyways given our drivers insurance. We're also running a bunch of grocery runs in many cities to ensure drivers who don't have access to the government ration system or the food or food on their own get groceries and staples through our distribution system. So that's one thing we did. We also enabled interest-free loans for all our drivers, in partnership with Avail. So all our drivers would have gotten interest-free loans for a certain period to again manage their cash requirements in the short term, and they can pay it back after a certain time when business resumes. And then we've done a bunch of other things for the driver community. It's very important that we look at our business from a lens where we actually help out our supply chains and our partners, etc. So that again, if once business resumes, those entities and organizations and people need to be ready to resume. Right? Yeah.
So in that light, Bhavish, there's a question from Chakri of Country Delight. I guess it's a broader question. For companies of scale, which have a number of these kind of partners, in your case, there is driver partners, in their case, also there are delivery partners. And maybe it's early, but will one need to integrate? So I know a bunch of companies will have to do insurance, but will one have to integrate some level of telehealth for monitoring and stuff like that? Because in manufacturing and factories, there are going to be practices that are mandated, that you have to do temperature guns and you have to do a bunch of these things, right? Any thoughts there?
Yeah, I think every business should look at what is how can they ensure a proper level of standardization and health for their workers and as a result for their consumers. And each business has its own context. And I actually believe it's going to become the norm, maybe by regulation, maybe not by regulation, but by just best practices where industries will have to ensure their workforce is healthy and sanitized and is not creating any concerns for their peer workers or even the products that are shipped to consumers. And I think this will be a good direction for all of us to invest in terms of capability building. I believe that's going to be a long-term situation.
Yeah. There's one question around managing stakeholders, Bhavish. So any advice for people on communication with various stakeholders? In your case, I guess clearly employees, driver partners. I know you've done some stuff with the government. So what any inputs for people?
The managing stakeholders is especially more critical in a time like this. What we have done is with our employees, we've been very transparent. It's a tough time. It is a very, very tough time for our business also, and we will all as an organization have to take some tough calls. And we have had those conversations with our organization. With the governments also, we've been very we've been trying to see wherever we can leverage our technologies to help in whichever way, be it the hospitals or the nurses or the doctors or the food supply chains or whatever, right? And not genuinely help, not help from a short-term profitable, from a short-term angle, but genuinely help in whichever way we can. We've also given whatever donations we can to different funds, PM funds, CM funds, and it's also important to have clear communications with investors. Investors need to understand how the situation is, and we've also made sure the boards of businesses have clarity on what we're doing on and taking their inputs also on what can be done, what they are seeing around the world, and then making sure the path forward is very clear.
Yeah. So I'll share a learning. We had one of these ACT seminars yesterday was was on the legal implications and it was also with Abhijit Joshi, and it was actually a big learning for me. And the net of that was this is such an unprecedented crisis that the strategy that is recommended is actually not legal but communication. And I think that applies to answer this question. Over communicate with all stakeholders and co-opt them into the solution rather than thinking of anybody as a problem. Whether it's a landlord, whether it is a partner of some sort, a vendor, a manufacturer. Think of everybody. Be empathetic. And this was coming from a lawyer in a legal seminar was interesting because the advice was don't think legal, think proactively communication and how you can co-opt the person. One question that I guess with Ola Electric experience you might have some input. Some people have impact from China on their supply chains. Is there any latest data on what is happening and how do you see any impact longer term?
No, I think, like you said, Avi, the China supply chain and manufacturing is now coming back up. The issue might actually be more now on the freight side or the logistics side, but the China supply chain is now increasingly getting up. And if the health situation remains as it is right now, I don't foresee it being a long-term disruption anymore on the supply side there.
Yeah, and that's my view. I think the factory output has actually scaled up pretty quickly. So I think longer term will be fine. Any thoughts on there is this FDI notification that came, and this is more just forecasting in some ways, and I guess it's probably our last question. How do you see a rejigging of supply chains and world order?
Yes, I actually think that's an opportunity. So while short term China will come back and we'll get supplies, but if you think as an industry or a overall Indian ecosystem, there are many opportunities which we as entrepreneurs should look at and see whatever we can do to build into those opportunities. And one of those is can we move our supply chains closer home? And I think generally the government, the direction of policy will be towards that direction. I believe capital will also be available for that. And if we all can think of how in our business models it makes sense to actually have supply chains within our country, that might be a very big competitive advantage also, and maybe an opportunity in itself.
Yeah. No, so I would actually thank you to everybody for asking. Bhavish, I'll give you a minute or two to close. Let me just pick up on that thread. My view looking at this, and I was talking to some people who have studied some of this over the period of history, is that this is not a crisis of small proportions. We all know it's a crisis of very large proportion. People compare it to Great Depression. People compare it to World War II. Nobody compares it as much to the Great Recession, and some people are calling this the Great Cessation because then there's no demand. And such large crises have generally rewired the world order. And America, Germany, Japan, they came throughout the post-World War II era with the industrialization. I would argue China and the US benefited the most post the recession, but clearly from the internet age. And the hope is this our time? Is India in the right place at the right time? But I think everybody on this call, and obviously the governments, but everybody on this call should be thinking of that. If you had a manufacturing business, are you going to be able to do more? So I think for me, the hope is that this rewires the world order in favor of India to some extent, and we take full advantage of it. Bhavish, thank you so much. Any closing thoughts?
Thank you, everybody. Great to be part of this webinar. I've never done a webinar before, so very exciting format where you can't see your audience. But this is the way things are going to be. But I'll also close on the same thought, Abhi. This is time for big games and big plays, not for small, short-term, opportunistic here and there, itsy-bitsy games, right? So this is the time where I believe if we make big bets, we work hard towards them, and we really think smartly and play into the forward narrative, we as businesses and India as a ecosystem might actually end up coming out very strongly out of this.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And on that optimistic note, we'll catch you some other time. Take care. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.